having me. I'm really excited to be here. It all starts with a quest, a lot like Nevil Shute's books. The quest started after I left university. I went to England on a work abroad program, and while I was there, I went to the village bookstore, and upstairs I discovered the whole young adult, teen, children's section was full. And even after well, I write for children or teenagers now, and my whole life that's been my passion. Through university I read plays because I did theater, but as soon as I was finished with theater I went back to young adult literature. And so when I discovered all these wonderful books in this little bookstore in the north of England, I came across a row by John Townsend. And I don't know if any of you know him. He's a British writer. He lives in Cambridge. He was born in 1922, and he's still there. He's married to Jill Peyton Walsh, you might also know. I had read a couple of his books in the States when I was a teenager. My mother had too, and we both liked him. And when I looked at the shelf, there was 12, 13, 14 books by John Townsend, and I was just blown away because the U.S. only had 3 or 4 in print. I didn't even know he'd written so many books. So I immediately snatched them up because university was much cheaper then, so I didn't have any debt really, and I had a job and I had lots of money coming in because I had a live-in job. And so I bought all of these books, and I called my mother and I said, I am on a quest. I'm going to buy all the John Townsend books. I'm going to hunt them down over my travels in England. And she said, well, as long as you're on a quest, I have another quest for you, and it is Nevil Shute. There's only 5 books of his in print in the U.S., and I've read a lot of them from the library, and I really want them all. So I'm going to send you a list, and you find them for me. And I said, okay, it's a quest, another quest, why not? So every time I found a Nevil Shute book, they had just issued these about a year before, this black one. And every time I found one, you know, I checked off the list, I put on the emergency credit card, and she would pay the bill when it came. Over the next 5 months, I managed to collect all of John Townsend's, almost all of his books, which number just over 20, and almost all of Nevil Shute's, except for the 5 that he already had. So what happened was, it was great. It was a fabulous quest. I succeeded until it was time to pack to go home. And then, you know, I'd already filled my suitcases full of crisps and biscuits and Cadbury chocolate and high London fashions. And I had all these books, and so I had some friends who were mountain climbers, and they said to me, you know what we did when we went mountain climbing in Switzerland was we packed all our light gear in the suitcases. And then we took our carry-ons and we put in all our metal crampons and heavy ropes. And all you have to do is, you know, when you walk through the gate, you just have to pretend like they're really light. They're struggling through the airport like this. But when they get to the gate, they walk through. So that's what I did. I packed all of these books, and by this time, between Nevil and John and other various books, I had probably 50 books packed into this carry-on. And I lugged it all over the airport. And I decided that after that, I really deserved to read all of these books. So even though they were mums, I periodically borrowed them over the next few years. And the first one I read, I actually had read a few while I was in England, and the first one I read was What Happened to the Corbetts. I think it's a fabulous book. If I'm going to recommend Nevil Shute to a first-time reader, I probably would choose something else. It's a little, you know, it's a little bit dark for him. But I was still hooked, and so I kept going. And I read Pastoral next, and then I was just hooked. So when I got back from my travels, I had trained as an actress, and I discovered the really drag about being an actress is you have to leave the house. And I seriously could go weeks without leaving the house if my husband didn't like drag me down to the village or didn't have library books available. So I thought, well, what can I do from home that, you know, I don't have to leave the house for? And I thought, I know, I'll write books. And 20 years later, my first book was published. It takes a while. Actually, it was only 17 years. And my book is called Restoring Harmony, and it is a book for teens. I'm going to read you the dedication. And then I will actually read you the jacket so that you have a little context for the rest of my speech. So this book is dedicated to my two favorite storytellers, whose books have enriched my life and the lives of countless others. Nevil Shute, 1899 to 1960, and Joelle Townsend, 1922 to present. And the jacket copy for Restoring Harmony is 16-year-old Molly McClure has only ever known a life where she grows her own food, depends on solar panels for electricity, and relies on horse-drawn wagons and bicycles for transportation. Since the collapse of 2031, her family has fared better than most, thriving on their isolated farming island in Canada. But Molly knows worldwide devastation lurks just beyond the shores of her home. And when calamities strike all at once, Molly is forced to leave the comfort of the island for the very first time, embarking on an impossible rescue mission to the U.S. The year is 2041. The oil has almost run out. Poverty and crime are rampant, and food is in short supply. Armed with only her ingenuity and sheer farming know-how, Molly braves a chaotic world where people are hungry and desperate, and no one is as they seem. But if she ever hopes to get home alive, she'll have to make some tough, fast choices about whom to trust, especially after a crime organization sets their sights on Molly. Her only way out may be to beat them at their own game. Luckily, there's a handsome stranger who's willing to help. I learned from Nevil Shute you should always have the equivalent of the handsome stranger. It just really enriches your book. And so that was one of the things I learned from him. Tonight I'm going to talk about 5 ways that Nevil Shute influenced my writing and will continue to influence my writing. And the first thing I'm going to talk about also goes to why I write for teenagers as opposed to anybody else. And that's hope. I think that teenagers have this great sense of immortality and hope, and it comes through in both what they read, what's written for them, and what they like to read. There's no midlife crises in the books because they're 15. There are very serious topics in young adult literature these days. You know, of course, pregnancy comes to mind, but there's the death of a sibling, the death of a parent, there's all kinds of bullying and horrible things that you might find in YA, but there's almost always something uplifting in these books. And that is what drew me to YA literature my whole life. I have this very cheerful, hopeful attitude, and so, to me, that's what I wanted to write, that's what I wanted to read, it was that simple. And Nevil Shute, I find, is one of the few adult writers who really just tells you the story. He sucks you in, he wraps you up, he doesn't let you go. And even when it's done, he just kind of follows you around and, haunts you with good memories. But the thing is that there's always hope in his books, always. His books are about war and famine and disease, or they're not really about that, but those are the circumstances of a lot of things. And yet, he always has hope. And so that's one of the first things I took from him. Another thing I noticed as I was reading both him and Joelle Townsend is that they're very similar storytellers. So they actually both influenced my writing in pretty much the same ways. So if you haven't read Joelle Townsend, I highly recommend him. The next thing that Nevil Shute always seems to do is he takes your average person and he puts them in unusual circumstances. In many books, most books, you have to figure the character has to rise to some occasion. But he always twists it a little bit. There's always something really unusual about the circumstances. Not always. Of course, some things are more straightforward. But, like Pastorals is more of a straightforward book. But Trusty from the Children, which I think you all have been talking about all week, right? He takes this man who has lived the same way every day, and if you ask him, he plans to live the rest of his life the same way every day. And yet, he doesn't think of himself as extraordinary. He just has a set of values, and these values force him into an unusual situation where it's not even so much that he's heroic, it's just that he gets in there and does it and enjoys the adventure. And so, whenever I write a book, whenever I come up with new ideas, I try to think of an average person and put them in an extraordinary situation. Which is what I do with Molly. I sent her out into this world that she'd never been to. My next book is called The Right and the Real, and it doesn't come out until April, but this is just the galley copy for reviews. And this book, it's about a girl whose father gets mixed up in a cult. She's a very middle-class, somewhat stable family, and he gets mixed up in a cult, and when she won't join, he kicks her out on the street. So she's an average girl in unusual circumstances. That's a big thing for me that I've taken from Nevil Shute. The next thing, the third thing that I always try, that I worked really hard on, is chapter endings. As you know, this is one of the things I tell people when I recommend Nevil Shute, when they haven't heard of him, or they've heard of him but they don't remember if they've read him or whatever. The first thing I say is make sure that once you have the book, you block out some time, because you're not going to want to do anything else. This isn't a book you're going to read 10 minutes every night before you go to bed and doze off. You're going to read it straight through, so you might as well just block out the time. Maybe you're on vacation, you give up your weekends, you're a fast reader, maybe you can do it in one day. And people look at me like I'm crazy, and then they take the book, and then they find out, oh yeah, good thing I had the whole day, because I couldn't put it down. And in fact, the other day, I live on a small island in British Columbia, and I gave this talk to I opened it up to the public, and I had a small crowd of 9 people come. And some of them were Nevil Shute fans, and some came because they liked my book. But one of them, when I told that part about recommending books like that, and telling people to block out time, this woman said from the audience, oh yes, I'm reading Pied Piper, and I have burnt 2 pots on the stove today. So it's true, because you just have to, you know that. So when I'm writing, I try to as I'm writing, but definitely it's something I check when I'm all done writing. I try to make the end of each chapter something that makes you want to keep going. And the beauty of Nevil Shute is that he doesn't do it in big dramatic ways. I mean, sometimes he does, but it's not always like, and then the plane blew up and we didn't know who was in it, you know. Oh, I gotta see the next. It's never that. It's like, and then she turned the gas on. And then you're like, and?